I didn't come here to give you a speech tonight, but I want to introduce to you what I would consider the kind of people who will make America the kind of country we want it to be. A friend, a colleague, a statesman, and a fellow Lutheran, the Honorable Byron Dorgan.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. Wow. I am excited to be invited to be a part of discussions with you, and I am not going to talk about all the issues we face as a country. I'm going to talk with you, I hope, about some special moments for me in public service. I made a list, however, of the issues, right? I mean, I'm just going to read them to you, just read them off. So you know kind of what sounds loud and louder these days on social media and on television and radio. COVID, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, poverty, immigration, taxes, race, climate, inflation, school books, abortion, guns. Well, pretty long list of what a lot of people are concerned about and raising their voices about, one side or the other. I'm not going to talk about those things, however. I'd be glad to answer questions, but I just want to say that we here in the United States of America, we're part of a world that has really significant challenges. And we face those challenges as well. And I'll talk about just a few of them, but I want to tell you where I come from. I come from a town of 300 people. My first 18 years, 300 people. Graduated from a high school senior class of 9 students in the top 5, which means that you're qualified then for the United States Senate if you graduate in the top 5. And it's a circumstance in my hometown of 300 people that you go to the Lutheran church, small little Lutheran church on the corner of Main Street, and you learn about faith, understand service, understand community. And it's interesting to me, one thing I have never forgotten in that town was that when someone died and there was a funeral in my little hometown, every single Main Street business put a sign, scotch taped, on their window that said, "Closed for the hour for Carl Carlson's funeral." Always. I have never forgotten what that means when you close a business for a funeral in a small town. That really describes community. It really describes value, and in my judgment, character as well. And so it's my hometown developed for me my character and my value system, and that's attributed to the Lutheran Church, to my community, and to my parents. And so that's what you take with you when you go do other things. And I have been so able to do interesting and just fascinating things in my life. It has been so wonderful for me. And I'm a Democrat, as Steve indicated. Steve and I are good friends, have been for a long time, served in the U.S. House together. He's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. We're good friends. We both come from rural areas. And, we served at a time when people wanted to work together. It didn't matter what party you were from. This wasn't about your political party. It was about your country and about your state and what you could do to invest and what you could do to make things better in your state. Now, I have a most unusual background. At age 26, I was appointed by a governor to be a constitutional officer in the state, of a statewide elected official who died in office. He had just been elected, and the governor appointed a 26-year-old. That's pretty remarkable. And so I went on to serve in the state capitol building as an elected official, went to the U.S. House, was elected 6 times to the U.S. House of Representatives, 3 times to the U.S. Senate, and then I decided at the end of all of that was 40 years. That's a long time in public service. And I just decided, I'm not going to continue. I want to do other things. I want to write. I've written 5 books. I want to teach. I was able to be a visiting professor at Georgetown University. I wanted to reach out and do some other things. I contributed as much money as I could to create a new organization called Center for Native American Youth, to focus on Native youth, the most left behind people, in my judgment, in our country. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But I've really felt good about the ability to do some of those things since I left the Congress. I do want to say, since I left the Congress, and even just before I decided to leave, the Congress has changed dramatically. It has changed in ways that Steve and I never knew back when we served. There's a volume and an anger and a disrespect about things that I never expected. And some of it comes from social media. You know the social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Say what you want without your name on it. And disagree with someone even as you disrespect them. I mean, there's so much of that. And on television and radio, yes, even with public signals, television and radio, we see more and more of that hardcore partisan stuff. And it comes back to something I told Steve about. 1988, there was something in law from the 1930s when we decided to provide licenses to television and radio stations. 1988, something called the Fairness Doctrine was abolished under President Reagan. He wanted the Fairness Doctrine up. The Fairness Doctrine said, if you broadcast a signal of radio or television, you have a responsibility to broadcast both sides, if it's political. If you're going to broadcast something political, you have a responsibility to provide point, counterpoint. That was the Fairness Doctrine. That was repealed. And as a result of that repeal, we have seen the growth of talk radio just on one side or the other, the growth of television signals that are just one party or the other, and it, in my judgment, does not give the American people an understanding in their mind to hear both sides of what is happening, unfortunately. So I hope that changes. I think it can change, but we have a lot to do in this country to think through how we deal with this issue of social media and the other things that create that kind of boisterous and far too loud kind of debate in our country. So now, let me tell you about a few moments, if you don't mind, that I have never forgotten and never will. The first moment, of course, I have to mention my wife. She's right back there, my wife, Kimberly. That moment was 40 years ago. Yep, absolutely. And let me tell you why I mentioned that moment. I mean, that's a moment that, of course, is important, right? 40 years ago, this year, she and I met in an elevator on Capitol Hill. Now, that's a pretty big deal for a Scandinavian Lutheran to be able to strike up a conversation. She's full Norwegian. I'm half Scandinavian. We're both Lutherans. And it was pretty unusual in Washington, D.C. to get into an elevator and find another Lutheran. At any rate, we've been married for 36 years. And that was my first moment that I'll never forget. And it changed my life in so many ways. Let me tell you of the next moment. It's 1987, and my late daughter Shelley traveled with me to Philadelphia, and it was the 200th birthday of the writing of the Constitution for our country. You know, this is a country of self-government. We, the American people, choose our government. We decide. The Constitution, its 200th birthday, 1987. There were 55 white men that wrote the Constitution. 55 people went back into Assembly Room in Constitution Hall to celebrate that 200th birthday. It wasn't 55 white men. It was 55 people. Myself included, I was chosen to be able to go. But it was men, women, minorities, African Americans. You know, the fact is, it was 55 people that kind of represent what this country's about that went back into that room. And in that room, by the way, where those 55 people wrote the Constitution, George Washington's chair is still sitting right at the front because he chaired it. His chair, where he sat in that chair during the constitutional writing, is there. Mason sat over here. Madison sat over there. Ben Franklin was there. And I sat there and I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. Just amazing, right? And so I thought a lot about the Constitution and what it all means and what it provides. And of course, what it does, it provides for the ability of the American people to cast a vote. That's power. The ability to cast a vote. Now, I want to tell you what happened in the Constitution and what happened following, over 100 years following the writing of the Constitution. If you go back to the 1820s or so, who voted? White men who owned property. Right? And in the late 1800s, there were a lot of women who said, you know, what's wrong with this? I mean, we'll tell you what's wrong. We are citizens as well. We deserve the right to vote. And they began to demonstrate. And I'll tell you just for a moment about the women that chained themselves to the White House gate in 1917. Alice Paul, Lucy Burns. Those two and 31 others were arrested, taken to the Occoquan prison, and beaten. Alice Paul was force-fed and nearly drowned on her own vomit. Lucy Burns, she had manacles around her wrist, tied with a chain, which they hung above a cell door, and she had blood running down both arms. They were called communists. They were called terrorists. They were disgraced. 2 years later, after that long struggle by unbelievably courageous women, 2 years later, the 19th Amendment was passed. And you know, during that Occoquan prison cycle, when the women were beaten, they called a doctor from St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the mentally ill, and they wanted the doctor to come down and sign a certificate that said Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were insane and would be committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. You know what the doctor told the law enforcement folks? Courage in a woman is not insanity. Think about that for a minute. Courage in a woman is not insanity. Think of what these women did to give women the right to vote. The reason I'm telling you this story is I think sometimes when we hear all the debate about who should be able to vote, we forget how hard it has been, first of all, to create a self-government. And then second, for women and others, and yes, Indians didn't yet have the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was enacted, how difficult it has been to get that right to vote. It's, you know, the 19th Amendment, very simple. You know what those women fought for? Here's the language. The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied because of sex. It's a very short sentence. And a whole lot of people sacrificed a great deal to get that sentence in the 19th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. So that day in 1987, in that room, sitting in that room, thinking of the 200th birthday, thinking of all that went on, and thinking of the 19th Amendment, thinking of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and others, it's a moment that I will always remember, and it's a moment I think about now, even now, as we hear so much discussion about who ought to be able to vote. It's an important issue, so important. Let me tell you about another important moment, if I might, that I have not forgotten. I voted for something that was controversial, I suppose, for some people. Perhaps even here, I don't know, but I voted for the Affordable Care Act. I did that because I don't believe that any child in this country, I don't believe the destiny of any child in America who is sick should be a function of how much money the parent has. I think health care is a right. And I think the Affordable Care Act was the right thing to do. Perfect? Not at all. But it was an important start to do the right thing. But I want to tell you about something that happened in the Affordable Care Act. I was going to vote for it, and I told President Obama, I told him 3, 4, 5 times when we met. Every time we'd meet, I'd tell him. And I told Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, and I was in the Democratic leadership for 14 years. I said to Harry and the President, I am going to vote for the Affordable Care Act, but I will not vote for it unless it includes the Indian Health Care Improvement Act. It has been 15 years that legislation has waited for the Congress to include it. 15 years we couldn't get it done. Of all the people left behind in this country, I insist that there has to be a part of the bill. Well, we got to the last week, and it wasn't in the bill. Wasn't in the bill. And I finally said to the President and to Senator Reid, I've told you this a half dozen times, and if it's not in the bill, I'm a no. Passed by 1 vote, as you know, that legislation. And it was put in the bill by reference. That is, there's nothing in this bill that writes the 180 pages of the Indian Health Care Improvement Act in the bill. It was, I think the parliamentarian said, only the 2nd time in history where they have incorporated a bill by reference, and they used a special way to do it. But as a result of that, I was able to vote for the Affordable Care Act. And I was able finally to force, after 15 long years, the Indian Health Care Improvement Act to travel with it. And that is so important. You know, this issue of the stain in this country of slavery, and the second stain in this country of the way we have treated those who were here first, the Native Americans. There is a man named Joseph Marshall who was a Native American historian, he was at an event in Colorado, at the University of Colorado, speaking to a group of people about the issues, Native American issues. And then some fellow in the halfway back in the room, he waved aggressively, and then he jumped up and he started shouting. He said, you know, I don't understand. What you're talking about is about your ancestors and my ancestors. It's not us. Why do you insist that somehow it has to do with us? And Joseph Marshall said, because you know the story. And when you know the story about injustice, everyone, has a responsibility to address it. So when I left the Senate, I donated money to create an organization called the Center for Native American Youth. And as I did that, we do youth summits on Indian reservations across this country, saying to Native youth, who I think are terribly left behind in virtually every area, education and healthcare and housing, in virtually every area. And as I have worked on that now for 9 years, it's a wonderful organization, cnay.org if you want to go look at it. But I'm proud to have created it. I'm still the chairman, and I'm working in that organization to see if we can do something that's significant and major in helping lift up Native American youth. And as I was doing that, I met a young girl, and I met her actually when I was in the Senate first, and then later. I met her following that period when she had disappeared for a long time. She was a young girl. She was 2 years old, and she was on an Indian reservation, and she was put in a foster home. And in that foster home, she was beaten severely at a Saturday night drunken party. Her nose was broken, her arm was broken, her hair was pulled out at the roots, leg was broken. And then she laid in a room for 3 days with no medical attention from anybody. And I met her. First of all, the story about the abuse in this foster home of this young girl was a front-page photograph, the most extraordinary photograph of this young girl I've ever seen. And this is 2 years after it happened, when she was age 4. And I saw that, and I thought, I'm going to go to that reservation. I went there, met with her and her grandfather. And she was not seeming like she was all there. She was humming jingles, but didn't seem to know I was there. And so, at any rate, I sent her some gifts. I fixed what was wrong on that reservation to make sure they weren't going to put children in places that were unsafe. But at any rate, I sent her some Christmas gifts and so on to her grandfather's address. Then her grandfather died. And then I couldn't find her anymore. When I would go to that reservation, I would ask about her. Nobody knew anything about her. Never saw her at all. Couldn't find her. Asked about her a lot. 27 years later, I got an email from her. And her name is Tamara. Got an email from Tamara Demarius. And she was homeless in Minneapolis. Been homeless for some long while. And I flew to Minneapolis, met with Tamara, and I decided to write her story, and she was happy that she said, absolutely, if it'll help other children, feel free to do that, please do that. So I wrote a story. It's a book called The Girl in the Photograph. I don't know whether any of you have seen it, but it's called The Girl in the Photograph. It's quite an extraordinary story of Tamara. But, Tamara is one of these young girls that would not ever be noticed by anybody if somebody had not written a book about Tamara. And I've written in the book and described the circumstances of her life since then. It has improved. It's not perfect, but it has improved. And so I really feel strongly about these issues, that moment of being able to demand on the Affordable Care Act that included something really important for Native Americans, for those who were here first. And so let me finally say that one other moment, and I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'm going to tell you one more moment, and I'm going to tell you about it just because I think it is something that I don't forget about whenever I think about America. So I led a group of senators and congressmen to meet with the European members of Parliament. And we met around a rectangular table. There were about 10 of us and 10 of them, and we were talking about our trade problems with Europe, significant trade problems between the U.S. and Europe. And so we're talking back and forth, and I'm chairing the U.S. side, and the former foreign minister of France is chairing their side, and we're going back and forth, and it went on for some long while. And then this man that chaired their side pushed his chair back, and he said to me, Mr. Senator, we've been talking about this for an hour and a half, about our disagreements and all these things. He said, I want to tell you something, and I think it's important you hear it. I want to tell you how I feel about your country. He said, I was a 14-year-old boy on the street corner of Paris, France, when the U.S. Army marched in, and a soldier reached out and gave that 14-year-old boy an apple. And he said, I'm going to tell you something. I will go to my grave remembering that moment. What we went through in France, the hunger, the deprivation, the problems, and then a U.S. soldier reaches out a hand to that young boy. I'll take that memory to my grave. And I thought to myself, this is unbelievable. Here's this Frenchman telling me about my country, who we are, what we've done, where we've been, and why it matters to him. And I left that table, and I think it today. I think, what a remarkable place this is, and how few people get to hear it. How few people really get to hear and understand how exceptional this country has been for so long. And so, with all of the challenges we face, I think it's important for us to remember again the words of that young man on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, France, telling us about our country. This is a great place. We've got to straighten a few things out. We've got to try to unravel a few problems and a few disagreements, but I'm convinced we will do it. Thank you very much.
I know I have a very loud voice, but this is for the benefit of the folks joining us at home. We're open now to question and answer. Simply raise your hand. Senator will recognize you, and then give me about 25 minutes to run to where you are, so that you could hold this microphone, and as I said, so that the folk joining us at home will be able to hear your excellent question.
I read your book, and it was a wonderful book, and really brought to tears by some of the circumstances in there. But at the end, there was the chapter about what can we do. And for the benefit of the folks here, can you tell us what we can do to help, especially the Native American community?
Well, part of it, of course, is trying to work through those that we send to public office to say, we want you to pass some legislation, enact legislation that addresses the significant issues. If I might just mention to you in healthcare, you know, our country, as we've grown over the years, we created something called reservations, and the word reservation comes from reserve. So that portion is reserved for Native Americans. Used to be a lot, now it's just a little. And, you know, it used to include the Black Hills of South Dakota, and then they just took it away from the Native Americans. So the point is, the reservations, when you look at health care that's delivered, we promised that we would deliver health care to Native Americans. That was part of our treaties, part of our promises. But we deliver about 1/2 of what is needed on the reservation. If that happened to everybody else, it would be a scandal. It would be front page that there's widespread health care rationing among non-Indians. But the fact is, it is routine with respect to Native Americans. So I think one of the keys is just to keep pushing for more and more resources that are devoted to the needs, whether it's law enforcement on reservations. And, you know, I know a reservation, for example, that's the size of Connecticut. And they have 8 full-time law enforcement folks. And if someone is being raped, or if someone is being viciously attacked or murdered, it may be the next day before they get there. You know, it's just staggering. So, at the end of the book, I also included some areas where one might want to make donations, whether it's Indian education, Indian housing, and other areas that could be very helpful to Native Americans.
Others? Alan.
Senator, thank you for those very interesting comments. Certainly a great time in your life to remember those things. It says here, and I'm sure you know the president pretty well, do you ever pick up the phone and give him any advice these days? And if you don't, what advice would you give him?
Say that again.
Do you ever pick up the phone and give the president any advice? And if you don't, what advice might you give him?
You know, the president's hard to get a hold of. He used to, well, they are. You know, Joe Biden used to sit in a desk exactly behind mine. He was in the last row, which is where he wanted to be. I was right in front of him, so I've heard a lot of him over the years. And Joe Biden is a good guy. He's someone, I think, who tries very hard to do what he believes is right for the country. But I don't call him and get on his call list very much, just because he's a lot of people who are now serving in the Congress and dealing with those issues. Just last week, for example, I was communicating with his chief of staff, Ron Klain. That's the other way to communicate with Joe Biden, is to talk to Ron Klain, who is the president's chief of staff. So I'm involved in some of those things. But let me just say, I mean, Joe, I know Joe very well. I've known him for a long, long time. He's a good guy. He's older than most people we have elected as president, no question about that. But I think he's still vigorous, and he still wants to do what's right for the country.
Senator, have you noticed a different type of person who runs for Congress today, perhaps with different interests, motives, aims, and if so, why do you think that is? Why is the type of person in Congress today, it appears to me, different than when you and Steve served?
That's a really interesting question, and I've thought about several ways to answer it. If you go back about 3 decades, you'll discover there's a group of people who, and they've been fairly successful, who decided we're not going to compromise on anything. In fact, they would get in front of a crowd like you, a town meeting crowd, and they say, I'll tell you something. You send me to the Congress, send me to the Senate, send me to the House, and I'll guarantee you one thing. When I come back to see you, I will never have compromised my principles. These are my principles, and you can bet on it and count on it. I will never compromise those principles. Well, the fact is, compromise is the lubrication of democracy. If you feel very differently than I do on something, but it's important, then we talk and we respect each other and we see, is there some little movement at least to move down the road in the right direction? That has not been the case in more recent years. And it's a group of people who have decided, we're going to tell the American people, you don't have to compromise, and we're not intending to compromise. Now, what I think has happened, and this is my opinion, but what I think has happened is those who are elected in Congress these days, and I should say this to you, there are some people that are really angry about who's there. The fact is, the American people sent them there. It's right. It's the American people that sent them all there. They voted for them. But I think what has happened is it's all become primaries. And so what happens on both sides, the Democratic left, but perhaps more on the Republican right, they are deciding that we're going to take positions that are way off to the right or off to the left. And that's really exciting to people who show up and vote in primaries. But it's not very exciting for the American people because they don't want to compromise on anything. And you're absolutely correct. There are a different type of people that have been showing up in the Congress. And it's not good for the country. So I always say, the way to solve that is you penalize the bad ones and reward the good ones. The question is always, who's the bad ones and who are the good ones? You have to make your own judgment about that.
Can you speak to some of the challenges of being a Democratic senator in a pretty historically Republican state, or maybe some of the lack thereof of challenges at that level?
Well, those are significant challenges, I should say to you. My first race for the Congress was 1980. It's when Steve ran. 1980 was the Republican landslide. I'm in a Republican state. Ronald Reagan, I think, got 67% of the vote in North Dakota. I mean, a landslide vote. And I'm a Democrat, and all Democrats lost in North Dakota on that ticket, except I won. And I won with, I think, 57% of the vote. I mean, when you think of how many people had to split a ticket to vote for Ronald Reagan and Byron Dorgan, it's quite remarkable. And so I'm not boasting about that at all. I'm just telling you what happened. And my own view is that the North Dakota citizens did not care too much about whether you were Republican or Democrat. I mean, that wasn't the magnet that got you there. The question, I think, always was, do we know, do we like, do we trust this person? I did town meetings all across the state all the time. I mean, my staff estimated that I flew back and forth to North Dakota 1,000 trips. Imagine that? And of course, each trip is 4 flights, right? You know how that works. But I spent a lot of time doing town meetings, and I wanted everybody that I represented to be able to ask me questions about what I did and how I did it and how I voted. That would give them the hope that they have somebody who listens to them and gets advice from them and is able to respond to them. So I don't know. I mean, I think it has changed in North Dakota now. The politics has changed. And part of that, there are a couple of reasons, but part of it is the oil industry. The western part of North Dakota has a lot of new people, and the oil industry is more conservative. Although, I supported all forms of energy and worked very hard, but politics in North Dakota, I think, has changed. Heidi Heidkamp's re-election was not successful, despite the fact that I think they knew, liked, and trusted Heidi, but I think that constituency got closer back to their Republican roots. But it was, I won 11 statewide elections in North Dakota, and so I was very successful, and it's interesting. So I told you about this school with 9 students in my senior class, and the little desks in that high school. And then one day, I'm in the United States Senate, and I pull out my desk drawer, because in the desk drawers in the Senate, every senator who sat there carves their name on the bottom of that drawer. And I pull out my desk drawer, and I see all these names, and then I see Harry S. Truman. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I come from 9 desks in this tiny little school in North Dakota, and now I'm sitting where Harry Truman sat in the United States Senate. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. And I'll mention one other thing to you, that I mentioned to you that faith and public service, the right way, travels in exactly the same direction in my judgment. And what I learned and understood at that Lutheran church in Regent, North Dakota, and from my parents about faith and public service has always been a part of my life.
Others? Could you talk about the role of money in politics? That's all I'm going to say.
Sure.
That's the whole question.
Well, it is the one issue that probably everyone in this room will agree upon. If you're a conservative Republican or a progressive Democrat, you probably agree that the destruction in this country of massive amounts of money purchasing elections is a disaster for our country. It is just awful. I can't even describe it to you. The Supreme Court has made a couple of decisions that have been horrible for our country. And it is not unusual these days if somebody decides from a big state, I'm going to run for the Senate, they need to line up their billionaire. And because you can find billionaires, there are what, 500, 600, 800 billionaires in the country now, or maybe more. You want a billionaire, and the reason is they can pump hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million into your campaign, and they can do it through 501c4s where you never learn who did it. Zero. You get no information about who's behind all this money. It's unbelievable. I think it provides dramatic injury to our country, and it relates back to 2 Supreme Court decisions that we need to find a way to respond to, but nobody's even thinking about it anymore. Now everybody has, super PACs, leadership PACs, all of these things, and it's very destructive to the United States of America. Well, that's really uplifting, right? I didn't mean it that way.
Other questions? You
started this.
Next time, sit up front.
He opened the door to my question. As a spouse of someone who sat on the ARTBA board for 25 years, we were spoken to not too long ago by a member of the House or the Senate, and I honestly cannot remember which it was, who said that they didn't get a lot done like they should because part of the week they're required to spend so many hours on the phone raising money for the Republican and the Democratic national committees. Was that true when you and Steve first got in government, and is it still true today?
Well, it is true that Steve and I both raised money in order to run for our campaigns, and you have to do that. But very often we would have fundraisers in Wisconsin and in North Dakota. We did raise some money in Washington, D.C., but it is nothing like what has happened now. What has happened now has been a gross distortion of what people would have thought about investing in campaigns, because this is a man or woman running for a public office that you believe in, that you think will benefit this country. The two questions about money and politics, we need somehow to address it. We just have to address it because it is getting much, much, much worse than it has been. And there, you know, the call time, I mean, that people have to do these days in order to raise money, it's not unusual to find a Senate race that costs $20 or $30 or $40 million to run a Senate race these days. This is bizarre. And that's because there's so much money coming in from really very sizable interests who in most cases do not seem particularly interested in public interest.
Good evening. In light of your two responses and thinking back of what you started out, what the serious issues were on your list, there's one issue that's not identified and it relates to those two issues as well as the other issues tonight, and that is the Voting Act. Is that not considered an issue?
Yeah. In fact, I think I mentioned that in the list. I mentioned the issue of voting because I talked about the writing of our Constitution and the discussion about who has the capability to make judgments about who runs our country. And I think I feel very strongly about the voting issue. I think there are too many areas in the country that are trying very hard to make it more difficult to vote. I think it should be a circumstance where you want everybody to vote in an easier way. I think our country should have a weekend vote. You know, start on Friday night and shut it down Sunday night. Give people a chance to, over a couple of days, to vote. But I want everybody to vote. I think only about half the American people vote now, which is pretty remarkable, right? I mean, it's when you ask the question, what does it mean to be an American citizen? Well, it's pretty remarkable, but it also means that we have a responsibility to vote. And I think legislatures that are trying in some ways to make it more difficult to vote, boy, they need to stop that, and there needs to be passed in the United States Congress the legislation that is being considered now. I don't know whether they can have the ability to get that done, but I sure hope so. I think it's important for our country.
I'd heard at one time that members of Congress stayed over the weekend in DC, and not just when there were votes that were imminent. And by staying over the weekend, you had a chance to get to know colleagues and colleagues' spouses, and if you were really interested, you even knew a little bit about the kids of colleagues and how they were doing. And it's tough to hate someone when you know their spouse and their kids and you've had a beer with them. Is that me just waxing lyrical, or is that a real phenomena that has changed over the years, the ability for politicians of both sides to socialize a little bit together?
Well, Kim and I know other families because we socialize with them, Republicans and Democrats, but that doesn't happen much anymore. When I talked about the 1,000 trips to North Dakota, much of that is on a weekend. And it's hard on families and things, but you also, if you're serving, you need to be there working. But I thought there were a lot of areas and opportunities where people, if you move your family to the Washington D.C. area, you see more of them. Number one, and number two, there's an opportunity to engage with others. And so, I mean, I would know children and spouses of Republican members of the House and the Senate that now I wouldn't know, but I did then because of the way we were able to work together and to go engage in opportunities to, where you'd have a social gathering. And so your question is appropriate. It is the case that a fair number of new people in the last 30 years especially have said, I'll guarantee you, you elect me, and I will not go to Washington, D.C. to live, and my family will not be there either. Well, that all sounds fine, but the fact is it develops, in my judgment, a Congress that knows less about each member, and I think it's not good. When I got there, Tip O'Neill was the speaker, and he probably swore you in, didn't he, to Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, and Bob Michael was the Republican leader of the House. And I mean, they spent a lot of weekends playing cards together down at the University Club on Saturdays. They loved each other. I mean, they worked really hard. And there were times when Bob Michael would say to Tip, "You can't do that." Or there were times Tip would say to Bob, I'm not with you on this. But the fact is, much of what we did back then was bipartisan because the two leaders really liked each other. They knew each other really, really well, and they knew their families very, very, very well. That does not happen now, and has not happened for a long time. And I should also now just say to you, I don't want you, as I've described these things, I don't want you to leave here thinking, oh, it's, you know, it's useless. I mean, things are tough, but the fact is, we, all of us, have the responsibility to decide what kind of constituents we're going to be and what we're going to insist on those who represent us. That's really important. The power of one, you know, that voting line. Thomas Jefferson stood in that line. George Washington stood in that line. We do too. And so we have great opportunity to decide what kind of a country we want and what direction our country takes. And again, the United States Constitution, it's a really interesting document, you know, the first 10 amendments for the Bill of Rights. And, you know, we've made some adjustments in it from time to time. And by the way, I serve, and I bet you do, Steve, as well, when you were in the House, we serve with people that think the U.S. Constitution was a rough draft. They want to change it all the time. And, you know, I'll give you an example of a horrible vote I cast. It was the right vote in my judgment. And, we had a scruffy little guy from Texas burn an American flag. He called himself a communist. He burned a flag. You know, they all smiled about it, and a bunch of people on the televisions were watching him burn a flag. And so there's a proposal immediately. We need to amend the U.S. Constitution to prevent flag burning. Well, you know, I mean, 80 or 90% of the North Dakotans would have wanted me to vote for that, but I couldn't. I just couldn't do that. I mean, where do you stop in terms of speech? The Supreme Court ruled that it was speech. I didn't necessarily think it was speech, but that's what they ruled. And so, where does it stop? So they burn a flag? What if somebody burns a Bible on the Capitol steps? Where do you stop? There just wasn't any way that I could vote for that, and I voted no. So then I had to go back and explain it. If you're going to vote in a way that's different than people want you to vote, you better explain why. And I went back, and American Legion had that as their first and most important issue. We have a very strong American Legion in North Dakota, and I called and asked if I could come and speak to their convention, which was happening a few weeks later. And I went and spoke to the American Legion convention and explained to them what I did and why I did it and why I thought it was important for our country. Anyway, here's what I want you to do. I want you to feel really good about this country because it's an unbelievable place. You know, Warren Buffett always talks about the advantages he had. Warren's an old friend. I like him, and he always talks about the advantages he had. First advantage, you're an American, right? You know, when you talk about all the people on this planet, this big old globe of ours, it talks about the first advantage, I'm an American citizen. Boy, that's a good advantage for all of us. And a wonderful thing. And it allows us to answer the question, what does it mean to be an American citizen? What can we do? What can I do? Thank you very much.
All right, we want to thank all of you for coming. We want to thank those of you who joined in live stream or those of you who will be watching this from the website video library in the future. We invite all of you who are on site to just follow Michael out the doors through the hall where we have wine, cheese, and a chance for you to personally share your opinions, ask your questions, or just get to know Byron and Kim. So thank you very much, and we are adjourned.